Thanks so much for the introduction. My name is Ross McLean. I'm the Vice Chair of GFAR, and I'd just like to welcome everyone to today and this evening's talk, wherever you might be, about repurposing food and agricultural policies to make healthy diets more affordable. So I think with the SDGs only 8 years away and the key hunger, food insecurity and all forms of malnutrition targets looming, it's a fantastic opportunity to discuss the state of the food security nutrition report. And it's terrific to have one of the report authors, Marco, and also Ivo, giving some policy dialogue tonight. And thanks to the GFAR team, to Hildegard, Eduardo, Esther and Charles for making this happen, and also to Syed for all his support. So welcome everyone, and I'll hand over to Syed for some introductory comments for the speakers and the context. So thank you.
Thank you, Ross, and my warm welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in wherever you are and whatever time it is in the world. This is our third talk, and they've all both so far have been extremely interactive, and that's our intention today. We have two excellent and eminent speakers, and Ross has introduced them already. I want to set the context, and I also want to ask at the outset that if you have questions, comments, suggestions, please feed them into the chat box, and we'll try and include those in the time we've got available. The format will be that our two speakers will each speak for 15 minutes maximum, and they will actually put forward their introductory comments and presentations, followed by a moderated Q&A, which is essentially me talking to both of them through you. In fact, questions that you will be sending to me that I've already been getting. So thank you for that. And then Jenna Tesdell will be making some concluding remarks at the end of the session this morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is. Now, I want to set the context because this is a really important talk, and I really want to give us some time to reflect on why it's so important. Just in terms of food and agricultural sector subsidies, there are, on average, over the last 5 years, $630 billion that actually have been devoted to subsidies. And of these, $446 billion, about 70%, have been towards price incentives and disincentives to farmers. So that's the scale of global subsidies to agriculture, very significant. At the same time, and this is not a consequence entirely of COVID, but the direction that we have moved in, is that we now have between 702 and 828 million people facing hunger. And that number has increased in the last 4 or 5 years. There's a gender gap. In other words, 31.9% of those who are suffering moderate or severe food insecurity are women, compared to 27.6% men. And that figure has increased in the last 4 years. And in terms of our sustainable development goals that Ross mentioned, SDG 2.0, hunger and improved nutrition by 2030, at the current estimates, we are on target for 670 million people who would be undernourished by 2030 unless there's a dramatic change in direction. So that's the context. And I should say that I think we're all aware of this. Global consumer prices were higher at the end of 2020 than at any month in the previous 6 years. So we have this global crisis, food crisis, nutrition crisis, and the consequences, of course, of current war in Ukraine, which was a topic of our previous GFAR talk as well. But of course, all these other factors are all moving towards this crisis that we're going to have policies that take us to a better place than we are now. I'm going to introduce, first of all, Marco, who's going to give the introductory comments from his side. Marco is the Deputy Director of Agrifood Economics at FAO, and extremely importantly, he directs 2 key reports, the state of food security and nutrition in the world, and the state of food and agriculture, reports that those involved in research and policy very familiar with those reports, and these are very key reports that we use as the baseline for our own work. So these reports are extremely important. He'll use them in the context of his presentation. Straight afterwards, Ivo Jenik, who is a senior financial sector specialist at the consultative group to assist the poor, CGAP at World Bank, and he will look at options that we have in terms of policy sector tools to help change agricultural policy. Now, let me introduce Marco first with a statement from the report that he is a co-author of. And this statement is really, I think, the context for this talk. This year's report should dispel any lingering doubts that the world is moving backwards in its efforts to end hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition in all its forms. We are now only 8 years away from 2030, the SDG target year. The distance to reach many of the SDG 2 targets is growing wider each year, while the time to 2030 is narrowing. So with that context, please can I hand over to Marco for your introductory presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Syed, for your introductory remarks and also laying out some of the key context, and also to Ross for mentioning the SDGs as well quite a bit, because it is all linked. And I believe, will somebody share the screen with my presentation, or should I do it myself? Okay, it's coming now. Perfect. So let me then, if we move to the next there, we can stay in the third slide, the one on the context. I can basically link up pretty well to what Syed was saying. If you go to the next, please. What we are observing is not good news, right? And it's like when you do these reports, it's like you are really hoping that the next one will give you a different picture. And unfortunately, we are seeing that with events going on in the world, the pandemic is not over. Then the war in Ukraine, world hunger rose again further in 2021, and the outlook going forward to 2030 is pretty bleak. It's not really showing us that there may be a turning point where things may start looking differently. There are many million people. If you go to the upper bound, 128 million people face hunger in 2021, and this is 150 million more since 2019. We have inequalities that are widening in the world. The pandemic was a factor, of course, in these inequalities, and these inequalities are challenging any efforts that the world is put into eradicating hunger. You mentioned, Syed, that many billion people, 2.3 billion people who experience food insecurity. And these are not people who are experiencing, necessarily speaking, hunger. These are people who may be eating, but they are not eating well, and they are not eating regularly. So they have a problem of food insecurity that is very important, because that together with hunger basically translate into the problems of malnutrition in the multiple forms that we have been seeing. The world is not on track to achieve global nutrition targets. There are problems there as well. And then we have been paying a lot of attention to how much does it cost to afford a healthy diet. And when you start playing around with that question, then you find out, unfortunately, that about almost 3.1 billion people could not afford a healthy diet in 2020. So it's likely that this number will increase in 2021 if we see what is going on. So FAO, with the partners of the software report, have been trying to understand what could be solutions. And as Syed said, we are running short of time. So solutions will always be about financing, and the co-speaker will speak about this. But also solutions will be about how do we reinvent ourselves with what we have. So if we go to the next, please, we have been trying to then understand what could be solutions, and solutions that use what we have, what resources what we have, and how we use the resources better. We notice that agricultural support policies in the world are providing vast transfers to farmers. And that's something we were observing for a while. And of course, these expenditures from the public purse have had some good outcomes. We cannot deny that. They have boosted global food production, particularly of staple crops. They have also, therefore, reduced hunger and poverty somehow. However, what we see is that there are serious concerns as well with regards to the impacts on sustainability, on health, and on inequality that these different forms of support are having in the world. We also noticed that there have been a number of reports recently on the issue of public spending to food and agriculture and repurposing it that have been dealing a lot with the impacts on income and the impacts on environmental sustainability. but we detected that there was a gap in terms of understanding how the current policy support is affecting the cost of the healthy diet. With so many billion people not being able to afford a healthy diet, you know, this was begging the question, of course, how can the current policy support be used in a way that enables to reduce the cost of the healthy diet? Next, please. No, let's skip right here because I think Syed already mentioned some numbers. So as you see, Syed mentioned the 630 billion people, billion US dollars. Now, it's very important that we differentiate between what is subsidies and what is not subsidies. Not all of this is subsidies, right? So there is a part of this agricultural support that goes through the prices. Price, we call it price incentives. And here you are basically talking about border measures, which are trade tariffs, import quotas, export taxes, all that stuff that we call trade policy, but also market price regulations. And in some countries, there is a lot of price incentives to these policies. But some countries have also disincentivized farmers by having the negative, the contrary, in order to protect consumers. Those countries are mostly low-income countries. What is important to mention here is that most of the support takes place through price incentives, but as you can see, there are other forms of support. The fiscal subsidies to producers are one of them. And they are different. Some of them are tied to input use, to the specific fertilizer, or some of them are tied to the production of a certain commodity. Now, you can see that on the right-hand side of this table, there are two other forms of support. What we call general services support, which is about $111 million. It's very important to mention that this is supporting the sector collectively. It is an infrastructure development project, for example, is rural roads. So this is affecting collectively, but all the other forms of support, including those for the producers, but also the subsidies to consumers, target individuals. And this is very important to mention. If we go to the next, please. So what we have noticed is that the policy support to food and agriculture, if you see this table, differs across country income groups. So this also reflects between country inequalities as well. And what we see also is that the price incentives and fiscal subsidies have been the most widely used forms of support in high-income countries. But importantly, these forms of support are also becoming more popular in upper middle-income countries. It's like upper middle-income countries are following suit in terms of how they support. Low-income countries, on the contrary, they have little to really use from the public purse to support. And it's very unfortunate that the type of support that can produce better productivity outcomes in the longer term, which is the general services support, it's very low. It's very low generally, but even more so in low-income countries. If we go to the next, you will also observe something very interesting. And it is the fact that in this graph, you can very quickly show by different groups of countries that the policy support to food and agriculture also differs according to the food groups and commodities that are being promoted. And the differences are also seen across income group countries. So this is very important. And what it shows also is that support to agricultural production largely concentrates on staple foods, dairy and other protein-rich foods. And also, this is especially seen in high-income and upper middle-income countries. Rice, sugar, meats of various types as well, are the foods most incentivized worldwide, while producers of fruits and vegetables, for example, are less supported generally, or are even penalized in some low-income countries. So if you see these numbers here, the negative ones, I cannot point with my pointer of the mouse, but if you see on the right-hand side, lower middle-income countries and low-income countries have negative bars. It means that they are disincentivizing the sector, okay, or farmers in this particular case. If we go to the next, please. So what we observe is that the fiscal subsidies have significantly contributed to growing production and reducing the prices of staple cereals, beef, and milk, but positively impacted food security and farming incomes. But also, they encourage monocultures, cease the farming of certain nutritious products, which is a problem. Now, border measures that I mentioned already, which are basically trade tariffs or trade policies more generally, have been targeting important policy objectives. They are important policy to target policy objectives such as food safety, for example. But governments could do more to reduce trade barriers for nutritious foods. We see room there. The market price controls, such as minimum administered prices to consumers in low-income countries and middle-income countries, also target the staple commodities as well as sugar. That, of course, helps to ensure farm incomes and low prices, but contributes to imbalanced diets. If we go to the next, please. So how have we been tackling this analytically? And this is where the report gets into technical territory, but I will be very simple about this. We took a global model with IFPRI to simulate what would happen if all countries in the world all of a sudden magically reunited and started repurposing their support. So we generated a baseline up to 2030. A baseline is business as usual. It's like everything we recover and continue doing what we are doing. And we compare this to scenarios. So let's focus on 4, 5, and 6. What we do there is basically we have determined what are the foods for which the current consumption is below what the healthy dietary guidelines would dictate should be consumed. So we are trying to then repurpose to close that gap between current consumption and dietary guidelines. So we want to repurpose for removing that deficit. And we did 3 types of repurposing. 4 is we are reallocated price incentives through border measures and market price controls across producers to reduce that gap in the consumption so that they would produce more of these goods. The second one is we did the same repurposing, but only to fiscal subsidies to producers. And the third one is very interesting because we move the current support to producers to consumers of those goods that needed to be increased in their consumption. So if we go to the next one, and I will be very brief on this, it shows a graph with results. The bars, the horizontal bars, show the difference in percentage points, more or less, compared to the baseline scenario of not doing anything. And what you see here is very interesting because you see that the affordability of the healthy diet reduces in all the scenarios of repurposing. That's very important. Why is that the case? Because we are increasing here the support to the production of the goods that are not being consumed as much as is needed to live a healthy life. But this is not free of trade-offs. For example, if you see greenhouse gas emissions, they decrease in the scenario of fiscal subsidies to producers, but they decrease in the scenario of fiscal subsidies to consumers and also in the scenario of repurposing price incentives, but they increase in the scenario of fiscal subsidies to producers. And there are also trade-offs in terms of farm income. You see, when we say farm income there is 3.74% decrease in the farm income when you pass the subsidy from farmers to consumers. That's a big hit. This is just to say that no matter what, repurposing in different ways seems to be very good for reducing the cost of the healthy diets and increasing the affordability if you target the goods for which the current consumption is below the healthy dietary guidelines. But this is not free of trade-offs. If we go to the next, and I am almost done with my presentation, I just want to show you a slide on a deeper analysis that we did for Ethiopia. Next slide, please. So this one I cannot point you. I cannot use my pointer because I'm not sharing my screen. But if you see on the left-hand side graph, you have a column that is called base, right? Base is the budget of Ethiopia right now. How Ethiopia disaggregates and spends the money across different areas, fertilizers, extension in livestock, and so on and so forth. Okay, now if you look at the second one, which says down there without healthy diet affordability goal, just what we are doing there is we are optimizing the budget to achieve agricultural transformation objectives. Okay, so you see it's a different budget, but it's the same kind of money. We are not increasing the budget, we are just repurposing. Now, if you go to the right-hand side graph, if you see the blue bars, the right-hand side, yeah, that one, the blue bars are the difference relative to the base in the scenario where we have repurposed. So if you see the blue bars, you are increasing agri-food GDP. In the first blue bar, in the second one, you are creating 489,000 jobs. Then you are getting 450,000 people out of poverty. And then you are enabling more than 2 million people or households to afford a healthy diet with the same money in Ethiopia, but doing optimally, you know? So it means that there is room to do this, and it takes, you know, political will. Next, please. Now, very quickly, I have just 3 more slides, but what I want to say is that repurposing alone will not do the trick. We will need to complement repurposing with policies in other systems. I give you an example. You will need health policies. You will need, for example, social protection policies to mitigate the impact of repurposing on some farmers. If we go to the next, please. And in addition to working with other systems, you will also need strong institutions, because there is a political economic context that you need to navigate. You need strong institutions, and you need to engage the stakeholders in the process. In the next slide, I will give you my 2-cent conclusions so that Ivo can also enlighten us on certain issues that I will conclude here. What we observe here is that we can repurpose, and there is a lot of room to do repurposing with very good results, but we need to keep in mind the commitments and flexibilities under that WTO, the World Trade Organization rules. So it means that we would have to sit down as international organizations and talk more with the WTO about repurposing. Repurposing public support to food and agriculture. Repurposing public support that includes subsidies, but it's not only subsidies. There are many more forms of support. And we will have to be careful, because when we repurpose, this may not be fully equitable, because some farmers will not be able to transform productively to produce more fruits, more vegetables, and so on and so forth. So we need to keep in mind who are those actors of the agri-food system that we could also support, and also social protection for the weak, for the vulnerable. Now, in low-income countries where there is a lot of space to repurpose, because they already spend very little, it is important to do more or less what I show for Ethiopia. Think about your current budget and think about how that money can give you more value, the same money. If you repurpose optimally, you will start gaining more. But of course, they will need to scale up expenditure in public and agriculture. And that's why I mentioned here that international development finance will be critical for low-income countries to spend more also in general public services, infrastructure gaps, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, what I mentioned, repurposing alone is not an option. We need to think about complementing policies in other sectors and strong institutions as well. I thank you very much for your attention.
Marco, that was excellent, and I read your report, and the report is really well. It's essential reading, and I really recommend it to all of you here, because what he summarized, what Marco summarized, really gets to the heart of the issue. And I want really, before talking, giving Eva what is a really big challenge, is how do we address this in terms of instruments? Because clearly the challenge we face here is existential for many people, because what we have is, this take-home message from this report, the one thing you can take from it amongst all of that is, not only do we give incentives for bad diets that cause obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and early death, we actually give disincentives for healthy diets. There are many cases where we actually make it more difficult, not just easier for bad diets, but more difficult to actually provide healthy diets. And that's really going to be some of the questions that are coming in that address that. Let me now ask Ivo. So thank you, Marco. Let me ask Ivo now to really take on that challenge of what are the mechanisms we can think of in terms of instruments to address this huge policy challenge and the urgency that we now face, that it has to be something that we can see tangibly in the immediate future. Ivo, welcome.
Thank you, Syed, for the welcome, and thank you, Marco, for a great presentation. And of course, thanks to GFAR for inviting me to speak at this very interesting webinar. As mentioned, I work for CGAP, which is a financial inclusion-oriented think tank that is hosted by the World Bank, where our vision is the world where poor people can improve their resilience, seize economic opportunities, and live better lives through access to responsible financial services that better cater to their needs. And so, as you can imagine, the topic of financial inclusion is somehow related to the topic of agricultural policies. Many of our clients, if you will, are smallholder farmers. But at the same time, I need to acknowledge that I am not really expert in agricultural policies and not even in healthy diets, although I'm trying to follow a healthy diet myself, but that doesn't make me an expert, obviously. So for me, it's an unusual setting. I very often talk to people from the financial sector, the central bankers, ministries of finance. And so I'm very excited about the opportunity to share some of my learning and experience with one specific policy tool with you, and hopefully this way inspire some thought about how this tool that's been applied in the financial sector for past 7 years could be maybe repurposed for the policy change and implementation in the agricultural sector specifically. It's been inspiring for me, at least, because in preparation for this webinar, I read through different reports, and listening to Marco's presentation already was very enlightening to me. So I thank you also for the opportunity to learn from you. What I will do is to present the concept of regulatory sandbox. That is a tool that helps to promote innovation and policy change in the financial sector, and the concept of it first. But I will try to bring it closer to the topic of agricultural policy by giving one example that I believe is at the intersection between financial services, financial inclusion, and perhaps the healthy diets and farming more generally, and that is agricultural insurance. So I'll try to make it also a practical. But let me start on the next slide with defining what is a regulatory sandbox. What is the tool that I'd like to present to you on today? Regulatory sandbox is a tool for developing evidence about how new product, technology, or business model, in brief, innovation, works and the outcomes it produces. So it's an evidence gathering mechanism that informs policymakers about how innovation works and help them to decide whether they want that innovation to reach the market and scale, and under what circumstances. So you can think about it: if a policymaker wants to see a change or some innovation reaching the market, but isn't sure about how that innovation will interact with the live marketplace, Sandbox is a mechanism to test it out and then make a policy decision. The definition that you're seeing is focused on the very utility of regulatory sandbox. If you Google regulatory sandbox, you would probably find different kinds of definition that talk about how sandbox look like and what exactly it does, how it operates. And I think while the utility focused definition is perhaps more important because it goes to the core of what Sandbox does, it's probably also worth mentioning that those other definitions would talk about a policy framework put in place for small scale, time-bound testing of innovation under the supervision of a regulator. In this case, it would be financial sector regulator, but it could be a different kind of regulator or policymaker. Again, I will get to a very specific example of how the testing could look like. But before I do that, on the next slide, I want to show you that in the financial sector specifically, the concept of regulatory sandbox has become a global phenomenon. Launched in 2015 in the United Kingdom, it's spread across the world, and now this is data from 2021 collected by my colleagues. We see over 70 regulatory sandboxes around the world, either operation or getting ready for operation. And the number keeps growing. And so the question may be why it's become so popular. Next, please. And I believe that part of the answer is simply that financial sector policymakers and regulators have long been under pressure coming from different directions. Their mandates keep expanding. They've been through a different crisis, including global crisis in 2008. Innovation is happening at unprecedented pace with new technology, but also new risks coming and happening very fast. The legal and regulatory framework changing also very quickly. And so policymakers have been looking for ways to cope with this changing paradigm or changing context in which they operate. And Sandbox seem to be one of possible solutions and tools. And that is because it has some very important features or benefits that I believe are relevant not only in the financial sector, but beyond. So next, please. Some of those key benefits are, I think perhaps most importantly, a regulatory sandbox creates a space for sort of semi-formal continuous dialogue between policymakers and innovators, which didn't quite exist before. And through this dialogue and beyond, it helps regulators and policymakers to quickly understand what innovation is out there, how it operates, and collect evidence about all of this that informs their policymaking process. It also gives opportunity for innovators to lower the cost of innovation by getting a policy guidance and shorten the time between innovation happens or emerges and reaches the market and scale. So those are some of the key benefits. There are obviously also important risks or challenges related to the regulatory sandbox, which one of them is potential harm that may happen during the testing. As it is always the case with novel things and innovation, there is a risk of unknown. So it is very important for regulatory sandbox to have safeguards in place that minimize the risk of harm during the testing or provide some mechanism for remedy if the harm happens. The other important risk is low capacity of the policymaker to implement the sandbox because of lack of human or other resources or else. Because if sandbox is put in place but doesn't really work, it may do harm to the market and may harm the innovators' trust in the policymakers' capacity to deal with innovation. And maybe the most important risk here is the risk that regulatory sandbox gets applied or is applied in the wrong scenarios where it cannot really help or it cannot really have the intended consequences. And so because of this risk, next please, me and my colleagues have developed a framework for policymakers to decide whether they want or need a regulatory sandbox to promote a policy change in their own context. And again, this decision tree or decision flow has been done with financial sector policymakers in mind. So some of it may be very specific to the financial sector, but I believe that at the very high level, it can apply to any policy making. And we've indeed seen regulatory sandboxes now being launched in health, in telecommunications, for example, and probably in other sectors, because conceptually the framework can work really in any domain. So this three-step process basically asks policymakers to ask three key questions. One, what is the objective you're trying to achieve with Sandbox or other tool? What is the issue, the problem you're trying to solve that you see in your market? So basically, why a sandbox, why you contemplate a sandbox as a solution. And here we have a set of stylized answers that are answers that we've heard many times from financial sector regulators and experienced ourselves as we were implementing some of the regulatory sandboxes in different countries. Policymakers often want to just learn about innovation. They want to address regulatory barriers to innovation, or they want to promote competition and innovation. This list of three different answers can be obviously shorter or longer, and it can be very different for different sectors. But the point is, it's very important to first understand why you want to implement the sandbox in the first place. The second question is, since you now know why, what is the objective or problem, what is the root cause that prevents you from achieving the objective, or what is the root cause behind the problem? And here again, for the financial sector, the answers very often are compliance with existing regulation is costly. Regulation creates uncertainty that disincentivizes innovators, or regulation prohibits certain innovation to reach the market. So again, depending on your answer, you may or may not consider a regulatory sandbox. The last question that should tell you whether sandbox is a suitable solution or not is to address that root cause. Do you need a live testing, or can you address that root cause by amending laws, changing policy, changing how you interpret or apply policies, engaging in stakeholder consultation? If live testing is really what you need, either because you need more evidence about how the innovation works, or you just need a proof of concept to convince other stakeholders to support the policy change, then regulatory sandbox may be your solution. So what I would like to emphasize on this slide is that in our framework, and I think it generally applies to the concept of regulatory sandbox, you see that very often the policy change or the response to the needs of policymakers may be different. It can be really amending laws or doing other things, not regulatory sandbox. But if that life testing component is what is essential for a policy change, then regulatory sandbox is a suitable tool. And I'll give now the specific example that I mentioned is at the intersection between agricultural policies and financial inclusion and financial services. And that is agricultural insurance. We know that insurance is a very important tool that incentivizes farmers to change their farming practices, to invest more in a more sort of modern farming practices, buy better seeds, invest more in fertilizers, etc. There are researches showing the impact of insurance. We also know that in developed world, insurance, agri-insurance is fairly heavily subsidized, up to 50% in certain markets. So that goes to the point of subsidy as well and where it goes. That's definitely not the case in developing markets, where the lack of subsidies and lack of awareness and many other factors lead to very low levels of insurance, typically far below 10%. And so there are now ways or innovations that help to make insurance in agricultural sector around the world more affordable and easier to deliver to farmers in remote areas, to farmers who don't really think of insurance as something they need. And one of those examples is parametric or index insurance, insurance that is based on the objectively measurable big data analytics that can trigger payoffs based on, for example, satellite data about the floods, about droughts, and about other factors. I won't get into the details, but where regulatory sandbox can help is by allowing this kind of insurance to operate and reach the market, because based on some report that I recently read, it's estimated about 60% of, or based on the survey they conducted, 60% of the markets do not allow this parametric index insurance. And so it's one example of what can be tested in regulatory sandbox. And by testing and proving the concept, it can promote a policy change that can help, scale up that solution. Maybe last point I'd like to conclude on is that once you decide a regulatory sandbox is a suitable tool for whatever policy change you have in mind, the next step, and this is also on the next slide, is to design a sandbox that works for your specific context and for your specific objectives. So if you can go on the next slide, our team created this sort of a template that lists the common design elements of regulatory sandboxes as we've observed them around the world, and specific design choices. So policymakers who are committed to implement the sandbox then should think about what is the design of the sandbox they want. This is very specific to the financial sector, but I think it underscores the point that each market would face a different set of challenges in terms of the legal and regulatory framework, the market structure, the capacity, and those what we call threshold constraints should then inform the specific design of a sandbox, because it matters. It's not, there's not a single blueprint of regulatory sandboxes. So if you want to learn more about all of this and how regulatory sandboxes have been operating in the financial sector, maybe learn about some more examples and perhaps think about how this can be implemented in the context of agriculture policies, you can visit cgap.org/sandbox. Please, next slide. And there are two main reports that you can, on the next slide, that you can read and learn more about. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope this was useful, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. Over to you, Syed. You're on mute.
As I said with Marco, this was really a tour de force in the time you had available to cover this really important area. There's a lot of questions coming in, but I want to just mention, as an outcome of this event, is is that we'll produce a think piece for the event so that everybody will have access to a document, essentially trying to distill some of the issues that were raised during the discussion, in particular the presentations. And in that, I'll also include the links that you just mentioned. So for everybody tuning in now, we will provide the links for you to actually digest the detail, because in the time available, it's impossible to cover all of the issues that are in these important documents. The questions are coming in, and I'm going to try and, there's so many questions, I'm going to try and sort of précis them into key ones. But the first question, I mean, I'm going to take Marco first on this, but it says, in the title, it says repurposing. And the question is, if we talk about repurposing, it's because policies had another purpose initially. What was that purpose if it was not to make healthy diets affordable? So Marco, see if you can take that one on, please.
Sure. I mean, if you look at the SOF, in fact, there is a whole literature review on what the current policies have been doing, and they had different objectives. Many of the policies, of course, needed to protect and incentivize the production of staple in a country. Many of the policies had in mind food security, but food security may not be equivalent to diversity of nutritious foods that make up a healthy diet. A lot of those policies had as an objective to maximize trade, so or to protect certain sectors from import competition. So I can name a lot of reactive policies as well. Many of these policies, Syed and colleagues, have been there also reacting to events. You take, for example, the recent case of India, the export restrictions. So this is policy support that is there. So what I'm trying to say is that, and I said in my presentation, many of these policies have had great results because they have contributed to farmers' income, to production, to economic growth, to employment generation. But if we are to eat healthy and we are to be able to afford a healthy diet, the purpose is different nowadays. And the problem is you have many other objectives, because it's not only eating healthy, but you have the other SDGs on climate or environment protection. There are many trade-offs to consider. That's why repurposing is a key word that we need to hook up to and try to understand exactly how do we repurpose for all these objectives.
Thanks, Marco. And Ivo, this is the real challenge, because I know when we talked, 20, 30, 40 years, we've been talking about food security. Now we're talking about food and nutritional security. Even SDG 2 now includes not just improved, but improved nutrition, in other words, an outcome. So if we think about all of these issues, are there mechanisms using the Sandbox principle that can actually help us repurpose, or do we do it through the conventional instruments? Is this a particular case where switching to healthy diets could really be the subject of regulatory sandbox that would accelerate progress?
That's a very tough question, I must say, Syed. And I believe that the topic of healthy diets and affordable healthy diets is bigger than what Sandbox can solve on its own. But where I see Sandbox contribution, again, I'm not really expert in the agriculture policies, but where I see the power of that concept is by proving that something works better. You show the example from Ethiopia, I believe, which is very compelling, right? When you see the numbers, it's a very compelling argument for a policy change and for replicating the same solution. That's precisely what Sandbox can help you to do. You set up an experiment with a very specific objectives to prove or KPIs to show, and then you test it out, and the Sandbox gives you just a framework to do it, and let's say a rationale or maybe a justification that you're saying, I'm just doing a pilot, I'm just testing something out. But then at the end, you have that proof of concept that you can come with to convince the key stakeholders to change how they operate and how they see the policy. So that's where I see the power and possible contribution of regulatory sandbox in this context.
Thank you. And I think we want to get onto this as well, because of course it's, the elephant in the room is climate change, but it's also in the context of other externalities. So let me take that question to Marco again first. How do we repurpose policies for affordable, healthy diets? While it ensures that it contributes to mitigating climate change, that's a huge issue. But the other one is, while remaining profitable for producers. In other words, the producers and processors are also going to have mechanisms by which there's actually a profit for healthy food production. So how do you feel we should be looking at this idea that it's not just we must achieve healthy food, but it must be economically viable for producers, and it must not actually add to the burden of climate change that we are currently seeing agriculture as the biggest cause of carbon emissions?
Okay, this is a good one. This is a tough one, I would say. Let me give you some ideas. Fortunately, I have been thinking about these things, Ayet, so you are not really catching me by surprise with this question. Listen, there is a lot of literature and evidence that shows that in terms of sustainability, healthy diets can get you very far compared to other types of diets. So now there are ideas that I've been thinking about on how you repurpose to unlock sustainable private investment and to create the conditions for blended finance models. What I mean here is the following. An option would be, for instance, to repurpose money that we are currently giving to farmers to develop and disseminate more emission efficient technologies for fruits and vegetables and even livestock. Why is this important? Because you are lowering the cost of technology with public money. Agriculture is considered a risky business, and with the climate variability and extremes, it's being considered more risky. So the private investor doubts about investing in agriculture sometimes, right? So if you repurpose so that the public sector invests in these lower cost technologies that are emission efficient, then not only will you reduce emission from agriculture, not only will you increase land restoration, for example, but you will de-risk the business. And farmers may be more able to adopt these technologies and produce sustainably the fruits and vegetables that are needed and the pulses for the healthy diets. Another one example is, and this relates to the sandboxes frameworks, because these are ways where you need to get into a kind of a sandbox to facilitate the financing aspect. So for example, you can repurpose to reward the sustainable management of ecosystems, for example. For example, reallocating resources, public resources that you are currently using to encourage, let's say, small scale landowners to plant or maintain trees on their plot of land. What do you do with this? Well, with this, not only, you are helping the farmer to have more collateral for loans, because you are going to have trees and you're going to have wood. So you are de-risking the smallholder projects there. You can also increase carbon sequestration. You can also increase carbon credit capacity, and there's potential for funding projects in this way. And there are examples that are the resource-oriented mechanisms aligned with the RED Plus of the UN system, right? So there are ways to repurpose for climate that also will end up helping us to reduce the cost of healthy diets, keeping in mind environment and the environmental sustainability and the need to mitigate climate change.
Again, on that issue, and I notice in the report you talk in certainly in high-income countries about high protein being dairy. In other words, there's different kinds of nutritious foods, and therefore there are costs that the different kinds of foods actually have, both environmentally and in terms of sustainability. But if we take that issue, it's a question that, of course, very close to the heart of many of us in GFAR. The question is, can strengthening cultivation of endemic foods, in other words, let's call that crop diversification or source diversification, can that actually repurpose affordable healthy diets and actually make healthy diets affordable? So let's use the word affordable in the environmental and also in the economic sense. So maybe, Eva, if you can just reflect on this. If we had the opportunity incentive to diversify so that we don't use high impact, dairy as an example, environmental impact systems to actually achieve nourishing and nutritious foods, is that something which we can really take on board in terms of new policy tools? Because currently we're still trapped in the sort of argument of staple crops and major crop production systems and monocultures as the only source of increasing food production. Is that the only way of increasing nutritious food production?
That's a very tough question for me, Syed, to really answer. But what I would, again, in the context of the topic that I was presenting on ask is, how much of evidence you need to make that policy change. You know, what it would take in terms of, as I mentioned, proving the concept. Because I know that there are some experiments, but the way I understand the specific part of the industry is that it really operates at an industrial level almost, or very often operates at the industrial level, and so there's a big paradigm shift that you're arguing for by saying, you know, maybe some of the staple crops should be replaced by endemic crops because it provides it's more resilient to the specific location. It provides more nutrition to the population that is dependent on it. But to me, it feels like that's a big leap for many players who are currently involved in the value chain. So I would be thinking, you know, how much of evidence they would need to start considering to change that the way they operate, and would a sandbox that is by definition a small scale test be enough, or do you actually need to maybe start with the sandbox as a proof of concept, but then go beyond and do a larger scale experiment that would provide compelling evidence? I don't know the answer, but I feel like sandbox could be a starting point, but definitely doesn't feel like it would be the solution for it.
It may be one mechanism of a number, and it's something which we should consider. We are running out of time, which is a real shame, because this is really getting into a very interesting stage. But I just want to give you one more really key question. I've just come from the, as it happens in Italy, the Edible Planet Summit, which really was very interesting, because the big players, big four agri producers, the corporates were there. Though I have to say they were rather silent in terms of answering this question. But in many countries, here's a question that really we finish with, but I want we both should have a go at. In many countries, advertising pressure from large corporations drives people away from healthy diets. What measures and policies could be taken to counteract this influence and promote healthy diets in a more attractive way? Impossible answer in a couple of minutes, but let's just take that issue. Corporate interests have essentially supported unhealthy diets. How can we switch corporate interests to healthier diets, or other ways to achieve healthier diets that resist the pressure of corporate marketing? Ivo, have a go first, and then we'll ask Marco to reflect on this.
Yeah, I guess Marco will have more to say on this question, because this is completely outside of my expertise, although it's a very important question, obviously. But if I can sort of cleverly run away from that question and answer it in my way. You know, I mentioned that in the insurance, and somebody noted in the chat that it's really essential to increase the insurance. In fact, I have a number that, you know, in some markets, it's only 3% of the farmers eligible for insurance who are actually insured, which is incredibly low number. And so it could be a game changer. And I need to correct myself that I said 60% of surveyed markets did not allow. It's 60% did allow and 40% did not, which is still large number of markets. But what I want to say here is that, you know, there is something very interesting.
Oh dear, we just lost Eva at that critical moment. Marco, do you want to?
Sorry.
Have we got you back, Eva?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Just carry on.
Yeah. So I don't know where you lost me, but I was saying, you know, that insurance would not probably work without subsidies. And there is something very interesting about combining the notion of, you know, promoting ESGs, supporting healthy diets, and supporting farmers on which we depend by subsidizing the insurance. Maybe extending the concept of fair trade that, you know, is gaining popularity, and especially in developed markets, you know, more conscious customers are increasingly seeking the fair trade labels. You know, making the subsidies to insurance part of it, so that, let's say, more health conscious and richer customers in developed worlds are actually supporting the farmers and supporting the policy that they need so much in their market. So I'm not answering really the question that you asked, but I see how the promotion can not only change the diets and the dietary practices, but also can potentially help with the subsidies where customers pay for some of it.
Thank you, Ivo. And let me thank you, and let me give Marco the last word on this question.
Sure. Very briefly, Syed colleagues, here we have to work with what we call the food environment. The food environment needs to change. And it's not like you come and you shake hands with big corporations and they will change all of a sudden. I really believe in the power of public policy. And public policy can shape food environments. I'll give you some examples. I've been working with some ministries, and the first ministry I want to reach out to is health nowadays, because I can show them how the hidden cost of eating badly, you know, when you take it down the road and you consider all the hidden costs of the medical expenditure that you need to incur as a person when you eat unhealthy, then you discount that to the person and you show them the bill. They get really scared. So you need to build the case for governments to understand what are the hidden costs of eating in the wrong way. Now, they have the ball on their turf. In what sense? Well, they have many instruments. And we were talking about one of them is policy support. So start taxing bad consumption, start promoting good production for healthy diets, go to school feeding programs, you know, work more with public procurement of food, buy from the local farmers the food and take it to the public hospitals and public schools. That is what we call food environments. So once that is there, you are sending the signals to the corporations on what is going on. And believe me, corporations are smart and they know how to respond to these kind of incentives and disincentives, and they will have to align. Over to you.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you on that positive rather than issue where we're really going to be polarized. We've got to move forward on this. So I want to thank both of you because there have been outstanding presentations, and the discussion I think has been illuminating for everybody watching today. 2 or 3 quick points, and I'm going to hand to Jenna. One, please could you put your cameras on? We'd like to take a photograph of everybody who's attending this important talk. It is recorded, so I think everybody, please make this available, use the link so that people who aren't here today will have access to this talk. I've mentioned the think piece, but I'll just quickly mention while I have the floor, there will be our 4th talk in mid-October during the World Food Forum, and it will touch on the very issue of intergenerational shift and change in terms of knowledge and action. So I think that would be a really critical one, because we've not really touched on the issue of disadvantaged communities and generational change, even though of course we realize young people have to be part of the solution because it's them who are paying the price for our current habits. Let me finish with, and thank all of you for attending. Let me just ask Jenna Tesdell on behalf of YPART to make some concluding remarks, and then give the floor to her to conclude our session today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saeed, and thank you so much, Marco and Ivo, for your very interesting interventions, and to the audience for the very lively discussion. I'm Jenna Tesdall. I'm the director of the Youth Network YPART. So, of course, we are looking forward to our next GFAR Talks on intergenerational exchange, because, of course, we see GFAR Talks as an opportunity for intergenerational exchange through the cooperation in the GFAR network and the cooperation on the GFAR Talks. So we thank you so much. And of course, we found the discussion very interesting today because I think that we got really an overview of ways that we can repurpose policies, but then also a concrete tool for one way that we could build the political will that is sometimes really lacking to make these policy changes. And so I hope that this is just one seed of a bigger crop that grows in our network for policy redirecting, for policy repurposing, and that this discussion grows within our network. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, and goodbye.